This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Phew! I'm already feeling better after the new president has been inaugurated. I am particularly looking forward to a competent handling of the COVID-19 crisis. I know Biden was not everyone's first choice. I am hopeful that he will be extraordinarily competent in a time where competence is greatly needed. I want to thank my new raters and reviewers in the Apple Podcast Store. Thank you to IMR66 and Blushing Beetle. It's much appreciated. I also want to thank Mike T for editing this week's episode. I am about a day away from doing an interview with Alice Gretchen, who has authored the book Wayward. It is an amazing book. I've really enjoyed reading that. That episode will come out on the 1st of February, so look forward to that episode. On to today's show. My guest today is Logan Thomas. Logan has a blog called Beyond Belief, and he has sprung onto the social media stage after his deconstruction and deconversion process. On his blog, he talks about coming out both as a gay man and as no longer believing in Christianity. Logan recently did an interview with John Steingard, and he's also featured on John's YouTube channel, which we will have links in the show notes for. But I've been incredibly impressed with Logan's work thus far, what he has to say on social media. He often does videos on Twitter. The things that he talks about and the way that he talks about them are really important and really interesting. Logan has worked at a church that is famous in the UK for their outreach and work within the community. He has also worked on a master's in theology. What I really appreciate most about the conversation you're about to hear is the honesty that Logan shares his story with. Again, as I often say, if you are a believer, and in particular if you're an apologist, please do not use Logan's honesty against him. This is what people feel. I guarantee you, people in your pews feel this way. So you can deny it all day long, or you can actually hear from people who are telling you the truth. Here's my conversation with Logan Thomas. Logan Thomas, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you. It's marvelous to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad we finally get to chat. Logan, I think I first came in contact with you. I saw you on Twitter, and I saw your interview with John Steingard, which I thought, wow, how'd you land that?
Yeah, well, I first came across John because someone I sort of vaguely knew from my university days shared an article on Facebook with the classic, Christian singer loses their faith. And they obviously shared it with this kind of idea that, oh, what a shame. And all the comments, well, hopefully he'll find his way back. And all of those marvelous sentiments. But I was reading it and I was fairly new to sort of deconstruction and deconversion, that kind of stuff myself. And I thought, oh, interesting. So I sort of being from the UK, I hadn't heard much about sort of Hawk Nelson or these other things before, but I thought, let's see. And I was just drawn to the openness.
Right.
That he had and this sort of humility. So I just dropped him a message saying how much I appreciated what he said and how helpful it was for me, and sort of just had a bit of back and forth sort of from that. And I thought it would be great to have a conversation with him for my blog, which I'd started up, about his sort of journey of deconstruction and sort of where he sort of was feeling and where he sort of landed more recently. Then had a chance to chat on his YouTube channel. So
I know that was awesome. So I just recently took a look at that, and I thought that was a really interesting conversation, and we'll probably have the links in the show notes for that as well. We'll also have John on the podcast, probably an episode or two prior to this one.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. But anyway, I was just really impressed with, it sounds like you're relatively early in this deconversion process, but you're already out there, kind of adding to the conversation.
Yeah.
What led you to do that?
Well, at first it was just venting. I was working for the church at the time
Okay.
as a youth pastor, kind of in a temporary role. So I was doing maternity cover, and it was sort of a few months before it was due to finish officially. But I'd arrived at this point where I thought, oh goodness, I just like this is not easy anymore, and I needed some place that I could sort of vent these feelings, because for most of the days of the week I was still sort of having to give these Christian ideas and these teachings.
Right.
I distanced myself more by that point. So, for example, well, first of all, the pandemic hit, and so we weren't even meeting in person. But I'd also made it, that I wasn't teaching or doing these sort of explicit sort of leading the sessions. I was sort of pushing it off to other people so I could like facilitate it. But it was just quite a frustrating place to be. And so Twitter became quite a nice place just to go and share my thoughts. And I was amazed that quite a few people were sort of in a similar place that I was. I had the sort of blog as well that I started up. Basically, I think also similarly, I was inspired by John in that when I sort of read what he was putting out there, it made me think, actually, like, I don't want this to be something that I just go through internally.
Right.
Because I think what happens a lot in the church is when people lose their faith, they kind of slip out the back door. They don't really make a big fuss, and they sort of just slink away unnoticed. And that's fine. If that works for them, that's great. Like, I don't think that everyone who loses their faith has to make a big show about it.
Not everybody has to have a blog and a podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if everyone did, then there would be a lot out there, because there's so many, I think, that do just go under the radar.
Yeah.
And I think in a way that kind of frustrated me as well, because I thought everyone has like a story to tell. And I thought, well, I might as well give it a go. And so, at first it was kind of just a way to air my sort of feelings and my frustrations. And sort of after 10 or so years of being a Christian and being quite heavily within the church and having to sort of write talks and sort of give Christian presentations, there was something about it that was really liberating, because I felt that I was finally actually able to do it, but in a way that was honest. Because for quite a while, I'd been feeling like I was just putting empty words together. Like, it was the stuff that sounded good. It was like the right theology. It was the stuff that when preached at the front of the church, you'd get like the smiles and the nods and the occasional amen. But it wasn't me. It wasn't really what I believed. And so there was something about it that was just very liberating, about actually being able to put these words out there that was something authentically of myself.
Yeah. I think this is something that the average believer and even the people who may be at the beginning of a deconstruction process don't realize the immense freedom, sense of freedom, the immense sense of catharsis when you are able to be intellectually honest, emotionally honest, to just say, I don't have enough evidence to believe this thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think when you're within that system still, when you still believe, I think you feel like you are being honest sometimes. I think I think you have to, because it's when you start realizing that you're not being honest that it falls apart. And so I think by nature of still believing, it's difficult to understand what it is like for those who have left.
Yeah.
Because they'll think, well, I am being honest. I do love Jesus. Like, I do believe this. And to a point, I would have thought that as well. I would have thought, I've got doubts. Of course, we all have doubts, but I'm still being honest. Yes. I'm still being faithful. I'm still being true. And so I think, like you say, it's difficult for them to understand, actually. And that, I think that's also one of the great sort of things for me that I'm finding difficult is when I chat to my friends, I kind of want to be like, can't you see? Like, don't you? Like, can't you see that this doesn't make sense? Like, can't you understand this? And and part of me was hoping, like a little part of me, that when I was having some of these conversations with people in the early days, that the scales would fall from their eyes, and they would kind of join me on the other side and be like, "You're right. It doesn't make sense."
Yeah.
But mostly what I got was like, yeah, that's a good question, or that's funny, or I'll wrestle with that. And I'm like, it's not quite the satisfying thing I was looking for.
I think on almost a daily, weekly basis, I have to let go of the misguided thought that if I just have the right words,
Yeah.
I just point them to the right resource, if I explain it in just the right way and I tell a story that they can grasp, none of that is ever going to work. Each of us comes to a moment of clarity on our own in a self-discovery process. And although I believe that you can nudge people in the right direction,
Yeah.
it will always be a very internal, personal thing that they come to on their own.
And well, part of me wonders as well, if we were having this conversation from the other perspective, of course, we'd be saying something like, you can't reason people into the kingdom. You can't argue them. And it's not about the words you say. You've just got to pray. Like, you've got to pray and Jesus will do that. So I'm like, what's the equivalent? You just have to wait, I suppose, isn't it? Which is probably what's meant by you have to pray anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, I've been fascinated in, both US and UK politics over the last several years. We've been witnessing what it is like for motivated reasoning and bubbles to occur of people being in their own echo chambers. And we're seeing that on secular issues as well. And where somebody on one side can't even begin to have a conversation with someone on the other side because we're not speaking the same language. And it feels like, for me, that's been helpful. I mean, it's terrible, right? It grieves me, but it is helpful for me to see that, this is just a human thing. This isn't just about faith, right? That's just one of the things that we seem to be on opposite sides of.
Yeah, I think, and part of what I am trying to do in this kind of social media journey is try to unpack how we can have those conversations, because it frustrates me. Like you say, it's on both sides.
Yeah.
And also, so here, one thing is this speed with which people revert to insulting and name calling.
Yeah.
I've been on the Twitter for about 6 months now, so it shouldn't surprise me, but it still does. Yesterday, I can't remember what it was I posted now, but I was reading through a response and I was like, they're making some good points here. Maybe I'll sort of respond to this. And then it just ended with 2 words and it said, "You're illiterate." And I was like, oh, okay. So I just responded saying, "Oh, thanks, buddy," and then just left it, because I just think, when you get to that, what do they expect? Do they expect me to come back and say, that's an interesting point, let's discuss this further? Or presumably they're just expecting me to retaliate or but I think, like you said, it's just human nature. I think what makes it so difficult about faith and politics is, I think it's so personal. So it's not like you're just talking about something abstract. It's not like you're just sort of debating, because a lot of, when you get, I suppose, debating clubs, or if you're in school or college and you're taught how to debate, usually you do it about something that doesn't affect you personally. So you learn how to have good conversations by having them about something that doesn't really matter to you, which means that when you have conversations about things that matter to you, it's not quite so easy to keep that good level of dialogue. It suddenly you end up feeling quite defensive. The stakes are a lot higher. And I tried to put out the other day this idea that we have to realize that when we're chatting about faith, whatever side you're on, it's never going to be like an abstract issue, because for Christians, it's something that's at the heart of their worldview. It's not, if you pick away a doctrine or the Bible or something, it's not like you're just having an intellectual discussion. Some people are more open to that than others. Like Christians who study theology will be more happy to have that conversation, but ultimately it's still going to be something about how they see the world, how they live. But then also on the other side, especially for post-Christians, it can bring up a lot of emotional baggage.
Yeah.
And so whenever you have something like this, you have to recognize that that's what's going on. And I think if people have these conversations thinking it's purely academic or it's purely intellectual or purely sort of theoretical, then they're not going to quite grasp what's going on.
Right. Yeah. I think, again, one of the things I talk about a lot is when you first go through the deconstruction process, deconversion. I love the way you said it on your blog. You admit to yourself, I no longer believe, that you have this admission moment. The first things that you find online are debate, right? It's all about the argument. And that's fun for a little while. But if you do it for, just 5 minutes, what you will recognize is it repeats the same pattern over and over again. And it usually devolves into what you've just described, into insults very, very quickly. Not a day goes by that I don't want to respond to something that is on Twitter. Like I have a salient point to make and I hold myself back. Sometimes I fail at that and I jump in anyway, but I've proven to myself that is not going to work, right?
Yeah.
Something in particular about a text-based medium is even worse. If we had, the believer on with us right now, we could have maybe a slightly more, not just kind, but, a useful conversation. But in a text-based social media environment, it's not going anywhere.
But it's quite dehumanizing, isn't it? You don't really see beyond especially because like so many icons are sort of anonymous ones as well. You forget that there are people behind them. You sort of see like a name, you see like an image, and you just think, right, well, this is my sparring partner for today. You forget that it's a person. I mean, sometimes a lot of what people say makes you forget they're a person. Like that's some particularly trollish characters. I look at what they say, and I really find it difficult to think what they must be like in real life. I think, do they sort of talk to everyone in like caps lock? Is that how, I don't know. But I think, like having it in text, having it online it has one extra barrier, one extra layer between the sort of the humanity and the two people that are meeting, I think.
The purpose of the podcast was kind of that recognition of, okay, this debate stuff is kind of useless. What do we do now? Like, how do we live our lives? How do we thrive after admitting to ourselves we no longer believe? And that's this idea for me that I talk about as secular grace. Yeah. And so, not to sound too preachy, but I think it's incredibly difficult to lay down my own ego and not engage in those arguments when I desperately want to. Yes. And that is actually ultimately, I think, a more loving response of just not engaging. So anyway, I'll stop preaching. We kind of started at the end. So Logan, what I want to hear is, what was it like for you growing up? What was your faith tradition? Did you take that seriously at any particular age? And then when the doubts began to happen for you?
Yeah. So I know you've had a few people on who are from the UK. And actually, I think there's quite a big difference from what I've gathered online. The church in the States and the church in England it's a very different thing to be a part of. But from what I see, the main difference being is that we often take things from America and then we sort of just tone them down a little bit, Sort of make it a little bit watered down, a little bit more polite. And that's kind of the church that I grew up in. So it was evangelical by name, but it's not what would be known as evangelical in America. So evangelicalism kind of meant that, you take the Bible seriously, not necessarily like inerrantly in sort of a fundamentalist sense, but it's your central authority.
Right.
It's like, I can't remember what it's called now, but there's the quadrilateral, which is like it's bibliocentric, like Christocentric, those other missiocentric. So that was kind of the church I grew up in. Both of my parents are Christian, so I sort of went along to the kids groups and then eventually to the youth groups. I was quite reluctant at first. When I was around sort of 11 and transitioning into that like youth age, I'd go along to some of the socials because I was at this sort of morning church where I had sort of some friends and they'd invite me along and it was great fun. And then some of the leaders of the youth group were like, oh, do you want to come along to like our midweek sessions, like where all the real stuff happens? And I was like, I'll think about it. And then I just didn't go. And actually, in the end, I still love this. My parents paid me to go. Just for the first two sessions.
That is the first time I've heard that.
It was brilliant. I got £5 for each of the first two sessions. But then, even better, I bought with the proceeds, I bought AC/DC's album Highway to Hell, and even further than that, I love these church things. They're always so trite. But we the way the youth group was structured, it was the 4 W's. I can remember it now, even 15 years on. It was welcome, worship, word, and witness. And for the worship, we would stick on like a CD and have some kind of, light meditative reflection. And I brought along Highway to Hell. I suggested that we use it for the worship time. And I think I was perhaps too young and naive to realize why that was not really taken up
Yes.
But even though I was reluctant to join the youth groups, I took off quite quickly. So it was a great place for me to be. Like I loved it. I think one of the main hesitations was just I didn't really know who would be there. Like in my church in the morning, like I'd grown up with these people for years, so I sort of knew them. Whereas I knew that in the midweek groups, there were people I just didn't know. Like it was quite scary. But after a while, I was like, oh, this is great. It's good fun. And actually, youth group became like a really central focus for sort of my teenage years. It was kind of the place that I felt at home.
Yeah.
Because like school, it's never that great a place to be, I think, is it? I think one of my good friends, he says like school was the best time of his life. You know, like he hung out with his friends, like it was great, didn't have to work, had no responsibilities. I'm like, I feel like that's the only, I think for someone like me who overthinks everything, that's just not a possible thing to take. Like I basically just wanted to get through that, flying along in the background, not drawing attention to myself. Whereas at church youth groups, I'm like, it was somewhere I felt like I could be me. And like most of my deep sort of real friendships felt like they were formed at church, possibly because we like had the shared faith and beliefs, but I think probably just more fundamentally because it was somewhere we could hang out and there was no real pressure. And I think we just did life together.
I think this is one of the things that I think Christianity and just religions in general do really well is build community.
Oh, 100%.
And I think one of the things that, you recognize on the opposite side of faith is that, that community was actually kind of useful and it's harder to find. But yes, I completely understand. I think you're telling many people stories when you say, maybe school isn't great for you. Maybe you don't, have the social group that you want at school. And then youth group is very welcoming. These people actually appear to care for you. And that's really powerful.
And that's one of the great marketing techniques of the church is they have community and they do it well most of the time. I have since spoken to some people like on this side of it, for whom the failure of the church community is actually something that led them to leave it. That wasn't so much the case for me, but I do agree that, that community is something that I think the church doesn't have a monopoly on, but they've had a long time to craft it.
Right.
So it leaves you quite susceptible to the beliefs. And so around 14, I think is when I started to take things a bit more serious, like transitioning to the older youth groups. The younger youth groups are a lot more about like, games and socials, like a little bit of Bible here and there. And then, you get to the slightly older bit and suddenly you have to take it more seriously. and I sort of went with that. And for me, like a big part was starting to read the Bible. And it was about, I think it was 14 that I did it. I'm still, when things are quite a while ago, I'm hazy on exactly the details. And I do wonder if I'm making it up, but I think it's true.
And that's why I say every time I tell the story, I know it's different. It's like, that's just the nature of memory.
Paul, isn't it? I saw a light and no one heard it. And then someone heard it. And
exactly.
I don't know, whatever. Like,
but precisely. That's the point.
We're all human. I think it was on a holiday. And for some reason, I don't know why, I'd brought the Bible with me. Maybe I just had no other books available at the time.
I love that. That's wonderful. Okay.
And I don't want to make the family holidays sound boring. I absolutely adore my family, but evidently it got to the point where I was so bored I had to open the Bible.
And
I didn't entirely know how to approach it. I know there are all these like Bible reading plans and Bible in a year and commentaries and devotionals and stuff, but I kind of just thought I'd just start at the beginning and see how it goes. So I opened out at Genesis 1, and maybe by this point, like I tried a few times because I feel like you get to like Genesis 3 and 4 and then you get bored and then you come back a few months later and like, oh, it's the same thing again about day 1 and 2. But at some point, again, timeline is hazy, but at some point it stuck and I kept reading. And for me, that kind of brought my faith alive, because until then, it had all just been about what we do at church. We do the things because the leaders tell us this is what we do. And you hear all this kind of like church language, but you don't quite understand it. And then reading the Bible, I was like, oh, right, so this is what they're talking about. Like this is Abraham and Noah and Moses. And suddenly like the pieces started to fit together.
And in the stories, God actually participates.
Yes. Which was a nice change. Although I think at that age that maybe that hadn't really been a big thing in my mind. I think it had become such like just a social club almost with a bit of Jesus mentioned.
Okay.
But yes, it's a very different world you get in the Bible. But that's actually, I think, what drew me to it. I think there was something quite exotic about it. And especially in the Old Testament, what I love, because when I then went on to study it, like the Old Testament was what I really focused on. And I think it is just this very different world of sort of rituals and of these kind of almost magical beliefs. They wouldn't call it that, but that's kind of what it is. Like, that's what really drew me to it. I thought, this is so different from what I actually experienced. So I hadn't quite at that point realized that this disparity was an issue. It was more just quite interesting to read. And I remember I was quite proud of reading through the Bible, and I got to like the first milestone of the Pentateuch. And I remember arriving proudly to a youth group one time being like, I've read the Pentateuch. And my youth pastor being so wonderfully proud. And I was so keen. I started, what I would often do is I'd pull some of my friends aside and I'd explain to them the story of the Bible.
Yes.
I'd be like, do you want to hear about how it all fits together? Me having only read like a few of the books of it at this point.
Right. Yeah.
But that's how much of a difference that made for me. Like, I think reading it gave me something to hang on to. I think in the everyday, it wasn't just about like the social meetings or the Sunday church. It was about this thing that I had with me all the time, that I could read whenever I wanted, and that I could sort of understand and think through.
I think it's also important to acknowledge that just the fact that you were reading the Bible puts you apart, right? Like, I think what on, again, this side of faith, and then looking at deconversion and things, the things that we have in common with maybe our counterparts in the faith who actually care about this is we have carefully examined these things. And that is different from the masses in the middle who have just gone along and never thought about it twice.
Yeah.
And there's something to be said about, you read it. That made you different from even some of your peers in the youth group.
No, absolutely. I think, from the beginning, then it was like, it was a Bible. It wasn't something that came in later. Like, it wasn't, like I should, like, I'm really serious about this. It's a number of years down the line. Let's dig into the Bible. That was kind of what started off my faith. And it did feel frustrating that no one else really kind of got this at the time. I was like, what do you mean you don't know? Like, about the sacrifices in Leviticus and all of this. Like, I was a strange teenager in that I was very excited to purchase it was a commentary light. It wasn't like anything heavy. It was one of those like Bible Speaks Today kind of series ones. Yeah. But I bought one on Leviticus and read it through, and I was like, wow, isn't this great?
That's
so I was one of the weird ones, basically. But it took me a while to finally finish it cover to cover. It took because also not only did I read it through, but I then decided I'd read it with like the inbuilt commentary. Yeah. Not from the beginning, but I think around halfway through, I hit like the Psalms, Jeremiah, and like, when like you've got the page and the top half is the text and the bottom half is even smaller text, it kind of just restates, because it wasn't even one of the good ones. That's the frustrating thing. It was one of the sort of the living ones where it doesn't really have good commentary. It's more like, here's the thing that we've just read, and you can apply it to your life in this way.
Yes. Should I be worried that you break into an American accent when you're doing it? Okay, sorry.
And the compulsive part of me, even though I think I wasn't getting a lot from it, just thought, well, I've started, so I've got to read that along with it now. And I started taking notes. And so it took a while to finish it. But by the time I was about 18, I'd finally read the Bible cover to cover. I was like, oh, amazing. And like, I think at that point, I was right in the center of my kind of faith journey. So I'd kind of gone through that teen stuff. I'd taken on quite a lot of leadership stuff at this point as well. So when it often happens in youth groups, you get through to the end and your youth leaders start giving you more responsibilities. So I was involved in the worship team and I started helping out leading it. And I'd lead a lot of sort of like services and worship. I do a lot of sort of preaching in the youth group. And so I'd sort of got to this point where I was like, basically my life was church. My life was youth group. The Bible was at the center of that. And I was at a bit of a crossroads because I sort of done like this media course, but it's not something that I want to do at university. So I thought, I don't know what to do with my life. And so I thought, well, let's just do a bit more church, So I applied for a youth work internship, and it was at a church it's the kind of one that if you mention it in the UK, some people are like, oh, that one. It's called like St. Andrew's in Chorley Wood, to the point where like I was getting help with one of the youth workers with the application, and he really said, "Oh, St Andrews, yeah, good luck. Like you probably won't get that." And I thought, well, thank you for your heartfelt encouragement.
Vote of confidence, yeah.
But I applied and got that, which was great. And so I basically did that for 2 years, and that was ultimately just sort of, it was like an apprenticeship in youth work. So you're at this church. It was actually one of the better internships because a lot of them you have to pay for, which I think is incredibly sneaky. That churches not only get a lot of free labor, but they also get you to pay them for it, and you have to like find your own accommodation. I was very fortunate that actually this was very well put together.
Okay.
We got a little bit of pocket money.
Yeah.
And we got to live with sort of someone from the church, which meant in my second year, I got to live in this B&B. Because that was just, someone from the church owned one. So I got like a room there. It was marvelous. Yeah. So I was just doing youth work for a couple of years, sort of starting to do things fully from the other side, not just being like a member of the youth, but now it was odd because I kind of still felt like I was at that stage because I was still just like 18. I was still quite young, and a lot of people in the youth group were basically my age. And now, like years on, I'm quite good friends with a number of them. Yeah. But it still, nonetheless, was kind of a step up in responsibility, and that kind of makes you think about things a lot more. And it was also the time that I came out, which was like an extra kind of thing in my story, really. So when I was 18,
I guess so.
that was one of the big sort of challenges to my faith. Yeah, it was just the first term after I started the internship. I was back home for the Christmas holidays. I mean, who knows what led up to it? I mean, it was like my whole sort of school life and teenage years in one way or another. Yeah. But it got to the point where I kind of realized that I sort of felt about guys the same way that my friends felt about girls. And, for most of my teenage years, that was something I pushed away. Not because, and, I should clarify, like not for faith reasons. So it wasn't again, the UK being what it is, like our church was never really one which preached against homosexuality. It was more one that just didn't really address it, which I don't think in itself is helpful, but it's probably better than saying it's a sin and evil.
If we ignore this, it'll go away.
Yes, and I still think that's their approach today. Yeah, and it's not going away.
Yes. Yes, somehow, for some reason.
Yes, maybe in a few years, people will they'll stop being gay. It'll just happen. Yeah. But yes, it was largely just for like conforming. Sure. I think the difficulty is when you're at school, the thing you want to do most is not stand out. You just want to fit in. You want to be like everyone else, not draw any attention to yourself. And unfortunately, things like being gay are the exact opposite of that. And so as soon as those feelings come up, you think all these things like maybe it's not actually what it seems like it is. Maybe I just need to train my mind to think differently, or maybe it's a phase, or all these other kind of things. Yeah. But it gets to a point where you kind of realize that's just not the case. And it all surfaced around when I was 18. And just on my first term, I was back for Christmas holidays. I admitted it to myself first of all, because you kind of have to do that before you can say it to anyone else. And then it was
around that same time period, or was that prior to that?
In honesty, again, it's difficult to know, because I think also when you look back on things, you always have a tendency to sort of reinvent the past, don't you? You kind of put your current feelings back into yours. But I know that it would have been around that time. Yeah, I think it was a fairly short period between when I finally admitted it to myself and then admitted it to others. I don't think there was like a particularly long period between that. And it was Christmas Eve, 2013 it would have been. And I met up with one of my friends from youth group who I was like closest with. And we basically just went for coffee, and I told her, and she was like, oh shit. Not because she had a problem with it. In fact, interestingly, she's one of my more like liberal Christians. So she's still a Christian today, but she's very much like on the progressive side of it. And we, in fact, had a bit of a minor falling out a few years ago when I had a weird conservative phase, and we were chatting and I was taking the whole like purity, like, God just wants us to be holy. Like we should lay down our desires. And she got a little bit annoyed at me because He was like, can't you see like how damaging this is? And I was like, no, it's the truth, or some nonsense like that.
I mean, again, I just want to just acknowledge, though, that even somebody like yourself, you acknowledge or have some hints to yourself that you're gay, and you can use the Bible, you can use this idea of holiness to warp what you know about yourself, right? Like you can warp what it means to be human, what it means to be you, right? And that's just super dangerous.
Well, that's it. I mean, when you have something like the Bible, or even just generally church teaching, it doesn't have to be explicitly from the Bible itself, but what the church teaches, whether from scripture or tradition, if that's how you see human nature, then yeah, like you say, that's going to lead you down a whole lot of sort of dangerous paths.
Yeah.
And so when I did then come out, that was something I feel like I didn't wrestle with at first. At first, it was just about coming to terms with who I was. I think when you have such a big shift in identity, you don't immediately think of theology. I think you just think of, oh goodness, like, what does this actually mean? And I had like a whole period of, it was sort of like once the floodgates opened, like I just told a whole load of people. So later that day, like that Christmas Eve, I went home and told my family, and them being wonderful, like we're totally loving about it. You know, they made it clear that they
great.
You know, still loved me the same. That didn't change their opinion of me. And then I sort of told various of my friends. And then when I went back for the internship, I was sort of chatting with my parents and like, oh, how do I sort of go through with this? We kind of thought it'd probably be responsible to chat to like at least the youth team and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of those odd things where it felt like the right thing to do, although it was difficult to tell exactly why it was.
Right.
It was like, it's the responsible thing to tell them, but why? But either way, I did. So I got back and fairly immediately, like I met up with the youth pastor who I was sort of working with, went for basically like for a few years of my life, everything I did was going for coffee, because that's what you do when you work for the church.
Yeah. Conducting business.
Yes. And you get to claim it on expenses. So it works out for everyone. Yeah. And so I told him, basically, I sort of came out to him, and he was very blasé about it. So it was very much like, oh, okay, yeah, great. And I think I said to him, like, I felt like I needed to tell you. And he was like, oh, why? And I thought, I really know why. But it was encouraging that it wasn't a big deal. And that was really good. But we nonetheless got to this point where, we decided we had to tell like the vicar. And I think I said about this on my chat with John, but we went up to the vicar's office, and it was one of those ice-breaking moments where you sort of arrive and it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, because you think, well, like, how could it not be? Like, how could like coming out to a vicar, which when you're not even the first person to mention it, how can that ever be anything other than like an awkward kind of thing? Yeah. So the three of us were sat there. It was me, it was the vicar, it was the youth pastor who had primed the vicar in advance. There was a bit of pleasantries, and then the vicar sort of says to me, do you want to tell me what you told the youth pastor? And I tried to break the tension. So I said, I think there's been a bit of confusion. I just told him that I was from Uruguay. And it worked. So it then felt a bit like, and then, we had this discussion, and again, it was one of those things where it could have gone horribly if we were in a fundamentalist setting. Like, I recognize that absolutely, and hearing stories from other people who've been through that, like, I just think how lucky I am. And so it was actually, in some ways, it was a very pleasant conversation. Mm-hmm. And for him, it was just more a matter of like clarifying like how I felt about it. Like, he was asking all of these questions, like, if I brought like a boyfriend to church, like, how would I approach that? But for me, like, those kind of things were just completely, they weren't at the forefront of my mind. I was just trying to work out, who am I? Like, what is going on within me? Yeah. And also, I feel like when you're working for church, that's like, it's a fairly mid-sized church, average age congregation, like 65, 70. Right. Yes. There's not really a huge amount of dating opportunities. Like, it's not really the first thing that comes to mind. And in a way, I think having those couple of years of just trying to figure myself out was really helpful. Because I think if I had tried to jump straight into dating and stuff, because most people who don't have, actually that's not true. I was going to say who don't have that religious upbringing. But like I was saying, actually, for many people, that's not always the factor. But let's say for people who aren't gay, dating is kind of something that comes slowly and naturally sort of through your sort of teenage years, to the point where when you're in your 20s, you've kind of had a bit of experience in that area. Whereas when you're 18, 19, 20, and you're sort of discovering who you are for the first time, I think to jump straight into dating, it's something that could potentially have not worked out super well, and especially with all of the faith considerations. So it was quite nice having a couple of years actually where it just wasn't something I was thinking about too much.
You're in your 20s too. You're figuring out who you are in general, regardless of your sexuality.
Oh yeah, I still am very much.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I can imagine that on top of that, then discovering that you're gay, that would be just a whole nother layer of self-discovery and trying to figure out your place in the world.
Yeah.
And layer on top of that, the issues of faith, and you work for a church, and that's a lot going on.
Oh, it was a mess. Yeah. And I think what made it sort of come a lot more to a head was when I then went to Bible college, because that's when I was forced to think through these things a lot more. I'd sort of gone through the, because I still, like, looking back, I still see those couple of years I had sort of doing youth internship. It's a couple of the best years of my life. You know, it was great. Like I had a really light workload, but like I was with my friends all the time. I was doing work that I loved. So I still look back, and for me, I love those years. And then, so going to Bible college, I actually ended up going just around the corner from where I went to church. Partly because I still wanted to stay in that community. Like over the couple of years, I'd really come to love the people that were there, and I didn't want to uproot myself again and go somewhere completely new. So I ended up going somewhere that was just sort of like a 10-minute journey away on the tube. So I still was part of this church while I was at Bible college, but suddenly, like, my faith took a completely different, because at that point, you know, I started reading the Bible again. When I finished the first time, like aged 18, I thought, well, what do I do now? I've read like the whole Bible. And naturally I just went back and started again. Like it had been 4 years since I'd read Genesis. So I thought, well, let's refresh myself. So I went back and basically just read through again for the second time. And you know what it's like none of it was completely new, but there was stuff that you'd sort of see fresh for
sure.
It feels like the first time, but also familiarity and sort of becoming more just familiar with it generally. But on top of that, at Bible college, you look into it in another layer. So I'd kind of already got a reputation at the church for being the one who knows his Bible pretty well, kind of thing. Like within, when we were planning youth sessions and stuff, whenever there was like a biblical question, it was like, you'd turn to me and I'd be like, well, let me tell you. And I enjoyed that. Like that's one of the reasons I think I went to study theology. It was just quite fun. Yeah. But reading the Bible is very different to actually studying it academically. And that's what I started learning. Because I mean, so when I say Bible college, again, I should probably clarify, because I think in the States, Bible college is synonymous with almost like a fundamentalist training center. Whereas that's not so much what it was here, because it was fully accredited by just generally a British university. So if you got a degree here, that was a degree. You could just get a job off the back of that. And so therefore they had to have certain academic standards and practices. It wasn't like, you know, an indoctrination factory or whatever. It was a legit kind of place. And there's a fairly wide spectrum in the States, right? You know, you can have, you know, unaccredited Bible colleges, scare quotes, but, you know, all the way to, you know, I recently had Ian Mills on from North Carolina, Duke University, right, you know, you can all the way up to that, right, where this is very prestigious, you know, that kind of thing. So there's a wide spectrum there. Yeah, no, definitely. To be fair, even within the UK, I think there's still quite a spectrum within it. Yeah. Although it's a level away, I think, from studying theology just at like a state university, because even though it was accredited, it was still an evangelical college. Like the lecturers were Christian, and you still had worship at chapel and all of those kind of things that went along with it. So it was kind of, you know, it was in the middle. It wasn't just fully studying theology in a secular place, but it also wasn't like fundamental. It was somewhere in that Goldilocks zone. Okay. So I find it fascinating, like studying things a bit deeper, but it, you know, naturally it threw up a lot of questions.
Mhm.
And again,
Yeah.
like the Old Testament for me was like a huge, and biblical studies generally, I threw myself into that. Like I'd study the languages, and like the Bible was very much the focus. I kind of sort of sneered a little bit at this whole like practical theology, or even like systematic theology. I thought that's not real theology though, is it? It's all about the Bible. And also I think with the upbringing I had, I was never someone who had the sort of fundamentalist 6-day creation kind of beliefs, or literal Noah's Ark. But, you know, I still probably had a fairly high view of like history in the Old Testament. So from like, you know, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, obviously that's poetry or whatever, but the rest of it, you know, fairly serious. There probably was a historical Abraham. Did he live to 175? Like, who knows?
Yeah.
Or maybe he's not. I can't remember what his age is supposed to be. Certainly not like the pre-flood 600-year-old ones who kind of wonder what kind of a life it is at that stage. Like, are they just these weird puddles of flesh and bone, like weekly calling out for help? I don't know. But so I kind of had some kind of view of its historicity. And for me, there were a few things that like broke that down. Like one of them was learning about like the origins of Israel, like as a nation. Because if you read the Bible, like you assume, well, yeah, they were slaves in Egypt, like Pharaoh tried to enslave them. And then Moses came along and he single-handedly led 2 million Israelites across the desert for 40 years. And you think, why would I question that? It makes total sense. And then you come up, you hear all these other sort of theories. I suppose the main other one being this idea of like the Peasants Revolt, that actually it's entirely possible that there was just another group within sort of, you know, Canaan that emerged and overthrew the ruling class or whatever, and created their own cultural identity, complete with backstory. And I was like, oh goodness, well, if that's true, that throws a whole lot of like the biblical narrative out of the window.
Yeah.
And like the other, you know, even like the conquest stories, I remember, and to their credit, again, like the Old Testament lecturers especially, I think, were just very honest about like the textual criticism. They didn't try to gloss over it. Like we looked at the Canaanite invasion and the story of, what's it called, the wall, Jericho, that's it. And this idea that, you know, according to archaeology, like when, you know, supposedly when they attacked it, it had been uninhabited for a couple of 100 years. And you start to think that's quite interesting. So either like the archaeologists have got it completely wrong, which is possible. I mean, I suppose none of these things are going to get it perfect when you're looking at a timing that's so long ago. But if it's true, you have to think, okay, so that's not real either.
Right.
And then another one for me is I was big on the Tabernacle. It was basically my nickname through youth group. I think it was because it was when, you know, I freshly started reading the Bible. Like one of the first things I came across was Leviticus, and reading through that commentary and finding out all about, I was like, this is just so cool. Like it's this weird portable like temple. And it just seemed like such an, because I think some things that always fascinate me are just concepts and ideas, and the tabernacle and all of that kind of priestly theology is rich with it. And I just loved it.
Yeah.
But again, I assumed it was real. Like I assumed there was some kind of tent that they went to. And then you start looking into the sort of more critical scholarship, you realize that rather than there being some kind of historical tabernacle that then became more solidified in the temple, it's more likely the other way around. You know, they're writing about this stuff in exile. They're obviously distraught at the loss of the temple. They're trying to recount their nation's history. And so naturally, when they get to the period of the wilderness wanderings, they're like, well, we've got to have some kind of way of worshiping God. So how are we going to do it? Well, we use the temple, but like we're moving around a lot, so that's not going to work. Well, let's make it a tent. So, which you know makes perfect sense as to why they would think things that way. But it made me think, like, basically when I learned about the documentary hypothesis, like, do you sort of know, you know, about like.
Yeah, but please just set it up.
Yeah, so basically this idea that rather than Moses writing, the bit that always gets me about this, I love it, is I can't remember which verse it is, but there's a particular verse somewhere in the Pentateuch where it says, now Moses was the most humble man on all the earth. And it makes me think that if anything is going to point to like the Bible not being inerrant, then it's got to be that verse. because
Yeah.
either like Moses didn't write it as it claims, or Moses was not quite as humble as he claimed.
Not to mention that Deuteronomy is the after he dies.
Yes. So maybe he was just very prophetic.
Yes.
This is how I'm going to die.
Yes.
Just going to leave the scroll with you guys, pop off up a mountain and, enjoy. Yeah. But yeah, so it's this theory that actually, rather than it being all written by Moses, based on a lot of stylistic elements, I think it was Wellhausen. I'm probably saying that wrong as well. I never know with a lot of the German scholars, like whether I'm saying it correctly.
Yeah, and I wouldn't know the references personally. So,
well, I think it was him, but he basically just came up with this idea that actually there are different sources and strands that come together with it. And like the earliest ones were probably around the 8th or 9th century. And they're the sort of more narrative kind of things that you get.
Yeah.
And they're sort of based around whether the name Yahweh or Elohim is used for God, and that sort of J or E. Then you get P, which is priestly. And that's kind of where you get a lot of the stuff about sacrifice and all of this stuff in.
Somehow when the priests come to power, they have a important part of the story.
Yes, they're controlling the narrative, and therefore when you write something, you write about what you're interested in, and clearly priests were really interested in sacrifice and particularly order, because it's the same with the creation narratives. There are two creation narratives. The first one's the priestly one, because it's the sort of the ordered one that sees creation kind of as a temple with a structured 7-day creation. And then you get the other one in Genesis 2, which I can't remember whether it's J or E, but it's the more narrative sort of one. It's more like, there was this garden and this happened, and there was Adam and his wife, and it's more of a story rather than day one, this, day two, this, And so basically learning that a lot of the priestly stuff was kind of just this later fabrication, kind of it threw me, because on top of everything else, I just thought, what can I believe? Like what actually is left as kernels of truth in the Old Testament? And from what I gather, I think there seems to be a slight like watershed moment when you get to the monarchy. I think that maybe when you get to around like David and Solomon, there's this idea that there probably not actually definitely was some kind of kings by those names, and all the other ones, Jehoiakim and lots of things beginning with J, basically.
Yes, Josiah, etc.
But then the stories surrounding them are not necessarily true either. So you get like elements of truth, but there's a lot of folklore built around that and a lot of political propaganda. But it just threw up this whole idea of, well, what can I trust? So I thought, well, maybe I'll just go to the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't looked as deeply into the New Testament as the Old Testament. And I think partly I was trying to save myself. I think I knew that if I did, like I was already a little bit familiar with Bible college being what it is. You cover everything, if not in the same depth. So
sure.
I'd learned about, Q and the different sources.
Yeah.
And all of that kind of stuff, and learned a little bit about Boltman and all of the, I can't remember the term now, but this sort of mythologization and things. So I was aware of, some stuff around that, and the fact that the Gospels are dated between sort of 30 and 70 years after. So even just knowing bits of that is in itself quite worrying, because you think, well, can I really trust this either? And so really a big part for me of the whole like leaving faith behind was a gradual lack of trust in the Bible, which had been sort of the center of my faith. I was never like an experiential Christian. I was never.
Okay.
So we had quite a number of slightly more Pentecostal members within both the churches I was at, and also especially in the Bible college, it sort of catered to a number of different traditions. But I was, other than a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling during worship, or trying to like give a word of knowledge, which is basically just some random water-themed idea that popped into my head. I feel like God is saying something about a waterfall. I don't know. Other than that kind of basic stuff that you, being at any kind of charismatic church, which was kind of, we were charismatic-ish, is how I would describe the majority of my church tradition. We had all of that stuff, but we weren't quite over the top about it. And you can't really go through all of that without some kind of, like, even with tongues, I never like spoke tongues properly. Like I did briefly, and I was like, is this it? Is this tongues? Like these weird noises I'm making? Is that what has transformed everyone else's spiritual lives? It's not really doing it for me. But I mean, that's a whole other rabbit hole I could go down.
I want to just summarize really quick, because I think this is really important, that your faith, it sounds like, was very much built on the Bible, having read the Bible, having not being an expert necessarily, but being, well read, you understood it well. And then as a process of actually going yet another layer deeper, studying the languages, looking at textual criticism, that began to erode as you began to be honest with, okay, maybe this isn't historical or this isn't historical.
Yeah.
It starts to slip away, the foundation that you have, till at some point, maybe there's nothing there anymore.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like at that point wanted to hang on to it. So I was not rejoicing at these sort of realizations so much. It wasn't like I hear people sort of saying about how it completely shook them. I don't know if I would say it was quite so dramatic for me. For me, it was a lot more about curiosity. I think it was more, well, what is the truth? I don't think it was everything has suddenly crumbled away, although there's an element of the fact that my foundations were slipping away. But I think I was just like, well, what is going on here?
Yeah.
And that kind of that combined with around that time as well, sort of through Bible college, that was when I then had to wrestle with sexuality and faith a lot more.
Right.
And so I think two things happened. So one was losing trust in the Bible. And then the other, sort of in tandem with that, was realizing I didn't really like what the Bible said anyway. And so maybe that's why, in one sense, I wasn't quite so horrified when it was slipping away, because I thought, well, maybe there is something, maybe there is truth beyond this. Like, it wasn't so much like, well, this is the best way of seeing, this is amazing and beautiful, I've got to cling on to it. It was more like, well, it doesn't really seem to be working. Like, what is beyond it? But there was still a very uncomfortable few years where I was still a Christian. I was still very much involved in leading worship, in youth work, and studying this, and trying to reconcile sexuality. So there was definitely a few years where it was all just sitting very uncomfortably with me.
Yeah. Can we address that kind of more directly? Yeah. Did you take a more progressive interpretation of scripture as it pertains to homosexuality? Or
yes.
Or did you have a particular hermeneutic that enabled you to marry those two things, or were you just in total cognitive dissonance?
I think a large part of it was that dissonance, because I basically thought, well, surely it's fine, like surely if there is a God and he is, because at this point I hadn't quite got to the point where I thought he's quite nasty, isn't he? I still thought he must be loving, that's what they say at church every day. So I was still thinking, if there is a God and he's loving, then surely he knows that it's fine. I couldn't really back it up with scripture, but I still held on to that. I thought it must be okay. But I was also surrounded by a community that, for the most part, did not think that. Okay. And so even though I'd come out, I still was careful about who I told, and I kept it still within my sort of close circles, which then shocked me. So one of the pieces on my blog actually is with someone who I met in the third year at Bible college. And he was very open about it, being gay. He still is a Christian. He actually takes a bit more of a conservative stance, which is why I thought that'd be a really fascinating conversation to have.
Okay.
And we had, over the last few years, sort of journeyed through that together and ended up in different places.
Yeah.
But even though, like, the first conversation we had, it was a classic thing where you welcome the freshers, you sit with, when you're having lunch, you sit with a table that's not your normal table, and you do the classic Christian opener, which is, so what's your journey? What's your faith story? Sickening. Yeah. And so, like, we're sat on this table, and he was sort of telling me, and, within a minute or so, he was like, yeah, and then I realized I was gay and all of this. And I thought, oh my goodness, he's saying this out loud, like, with other people, like, next to us. I was in my third year there, and it got out among, like, my friends, and some of my friends who weren't quite so good at keeping it to themselves.
Right.
But it was still, not everyone was aware. And so I had chatted with some people who, but also I will say, most people I chatted to were not hostile. They might have disagreed theologically, but they were not antagonistic. I remember one antagonistic conversation I had, and there's another one that was similarly, and the thing that links them all is they didn't know I was gay. Because typically people are
Right.
happy to rail against an idea until they realize that it's actually the person they're speaking
Yeah.
to. So the only
Exactly.
people that, I've ever had antagonistic conversations with the people that didn't realize that they thought it was just theoretical. And I remember being sat at breakfast, and it was actually with, I don't quite know what their role was. They weren't a lecturer. They were on staff somehow, but they sort of were at breakfast.
Okay.
And we're having this conversation. It got quite heated, and I got really frustrated. And like, I could see a few of my friends like at a table nearby, like looking over and smirking, and like, they know what's going on. But most of the conversations were perfectly like amicable. Like they were friendly.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what then, in a sense, almost drew me to this. They almost led me into this idea of, well, maybe that is true then. Maybe I do just have to lay down my desires and live a celibate life, all of that kind of stuff. And for a time I was convinced. I think for maybe a year or so, it was very on and off. It was like, it always would happen in the heat of the moment, like during worship. I'd be like, you know what? Yes, God is good. I can commit to this. And then the next day I'd be like, no, that's not going to work. That's not going to hold out.
Exactly. So I read some of your blog in which you talked about trying to make these kinds of decisions of whether or not you would be able to have companionship. And I wrote in my notes, we make this about sex a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
But really, it's much, much more about intimate relationships. So the question you had to ask yourself was, am I ever going to have an intimate relationship with someone whom I love? Which it breaks my heart that the process that you had to go through at all, that was necessary.
Yeah.
And all the people that we know who are out right now in the closet who are going through that exact same struggle of, can I ever be in a loving relationship? And it just crushes me. It just crushes me.
Yeah. And even when I was having the conversation with my friend, like that's what frustrated me a little bit. Like, but one of the questions I asked him was like, how can you worship this God who's put this imposition on you with no explanation? Because that was the other thing as well. Like, because when it comes down to the idea of intimacy, everyone says, well, it's okay because you can find your intimacy in God. And I'm like, can you really? Like, is that do you go home at the end of like a long work day and you're greeted by God who asks, how was your day? And like, is that really
exactly? And your conversation with John was about divine hiddenness, right? And so, I mean, very much that's the problem, that God isn't present, that we don't physically see God. And if we did, we'd be having a completely different conversation here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And which makes me want, like, because this is a big part of what I've been processing. Well, I think for my whole Christian life, really, is this idea of, am I missing out on something? I sort of think, because part of me does find it really difficult to believe that everyone's just, deluding themselves. Like I'd find that quite hard when the majority of my friends still believe. And these are people who I know are reasonable people. I think surely they can't just be. But then I sort of think, I suppose in a way I kind of was. I never really, because this is the other thing as well. Like, I know a big thing about people who have come out as non-Christian is, the backlash of that you sometimes get from believers saying they never really were a Christian in the first place. And I've said before, like online, like people that I know have not said that. I'm very fortunate in that my actual friends, that's only something I've encountered online.
Yeah.
But I've got to say, and I hate saying this because it seems to go against a lot of what I stand for. I sometimes wonder if that's true for me. I do, because I think there's two parts to it. Like, one is, did you ever have a relationship with Jesus? And that's something that like believers and non-believers will agree on. Like, no, they didn't. It's just that believers will say, we have a relationship with Jesus. They clearly never did. Whereas, on the other side, we say, well, no one does. But it's still something that you kind of agree on. The other side is, did you actually ever believe it? That's I think they're two different questions.
Yeah.
But even then, part of me wonders, did I ever believe it deep down? Or did I just go along with it? Like that's something I have to, I'm still trying to come, like, because I or even when I was a Christian, I was very aware that I didn't feel like I had a relationship with Jesus. It was always something that I heard people at church talk about. Like it was, it was sort of the central language of all of what was happening in that kind of life. It was all about, speaking to Jesus, like hearing words of knowledge, like it was all this relational language. And I was just constantly wrestling with this idea of, well, I don't know if I have that. Like I have the Bible. That was what I was clinging to. I was like, this is how I'm trying to make sense of the world through the lens of the Bible. And interestingly, again, in the Bible, there's not actually a huge amount of language about relationships with Jesus. Like a lot of that seems to be a lot more in the more contemporary evangelical church culture than it is actually in the Bible. Like there's stuff that obviously you can draw on, like it's not entirely without foundation, but it's not the central sort of idea of, me and Jesus, we're tight, we're great, like we hang out and chat. Yes. But I had to wrestle with this like continually. So it meant that when everything else was crumbling, when like the understanding of the Bible fell apart, when I was wrestling with sexuality, I didn't have that like relationship to fall back on. I didn't have like idea of, well, I know Jesus, like I know he's good. But I do struggle because I still wonder, like, I have to admit, there's a big part of me that thinks maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about it all. And there is something that I've just not been graced with. Like maybe there is a real Jesus that is alive today, but he just was not that keen on getting to know me. Like he wanted to get to know my friends and they've got a wonderful relationship, but me and other people who are in similar situations, he was just like, no, like I'll let you guys sort of struggle along in church. And so because I really struggle with the idea that everyone's making it up.
Yeah. I think so. A couple things that really I think are important. One, I think you're being exceptionally honest, both about, your former faith and the tenuousness of that, right? Two, I don't think it's your responsibility to worry about all of the other deconverts who have Christians telling them that they never believed, because if you decide that that was the case for you, that's fine. Yeah. But one of the things, I think the observation that I have is talking to friends of mine who have been atheists all their lives, friends of mine who, at about the age of reason, 12 or 13, decide, this is not for me. Yeah. Or friends who in their 18, 20, in their college years, they say, it's not for me, I'm out of here. And I think the through line is they recognize that the expectation of a relationship actually doesn't manifest, isn't there.
Yeah.
And so you have this spectrum from those kinds of people that I mentioned and other people who have a deep sense of something very real, something very palpable. Yeah. And whether or not, and I think this is personality, right? Like when I look back at my experience, I did have a real sense of connection. There was also something in the back of my mind that was saying, yes, but right. You can't actually touch God. You can't actually feel him. This is, so there was some hesitation back there, but I did have this real sense of God's presence. And the last thing I want to say is, I grew up in a really dysfunctional family, lots of drugs and alcohol, that kind of thing. And you learn that you don't tell family secrets.
Right.
No one ever tells you this, right? But you know this, even if it's not conscious. And I feel the same thing is kind of what happens in church. Like you learn by osmosis, by just being a part of the community, that you defend the reality of God.
Yeah.
That everything else that comes from external sources that is saying that maybe this isn't true, you reject and move on. You find reasons why that's not true. And so part of the deconversion process is the letting go of defending God. From my experience, when I personally stopped saying, I'm going to make excuses for this, I'm just going to look at it for the way it is, and it all began to fall apart. I'm not trying to equate the abuse necessarily of a dysfunctional family, but I'm saying it's this community understanding of we don't acknowledge that the emperor has no clothes. We never acknowledge that fact. And many of us are feeling like, he seems to be naked. Many of us are feeling that, but we have absorbed the mandate never to acknowledge this fact.
No, absolutely. And I think that's where a lot of the liberation comes from, doesn't it? That beyond that, you suddenly feel like, right, you can say, the emperor has no clothes on. That's no longer taboo. You can admit that.
Yes.
And suddenly, like, because when I then sort of was fresh out, it seemed like every day brought this new revelation of, and suddenly this makes sense, and that.
Yeah.
And I was sort of living at home with my family at the time, and I think they got tired after a while because
yeah.
My sister, she's also she sort of never went along with, she kind of never went to youth groups, and so she's quite happily non-religious. So she was like, yes, absolutely. And I think my parents got quite tired of just hearing each day, like, and this doesn't make sense, and also this, and this is completely human. But it's just one thing sort of comes tumbling down along with another. But also, like, with that kind of relationship kind of thing with the, because I also sort of did a post about it, because part of me really wants to study psychology, because I think there must be so much to it, like in that kind of way. But even from my entirely knowing nothing about psychology level, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, it seems to be this idea of putting a name to the dialogue in our heads, isn't it? Because we all have that. We all have this inner monologue. That's kind of how we process the world. It's like we see reality around us and we chat to ourselves about what's going on. That's just continuously there. And if we're taught that that's how God communicates with us, we're going to start thinking that's God. Like, because I sort of likened it to, have you come across the TV show Doctor Who at all?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm a big David Tennant fan. It's one of my defining features. It's probably my new religion. But it made me think that because I was about 10 when that became a big thing. And I thought, if I grew up with this show and I was told, like, the Doctor is real. Like, he's a real character. And like, what you're seeing on the screen is happening. But not only that, like, he's looking back through the screen at you. Like, he can see you. He knows what's going on in your life. And those thoughts in your head that sounds a bit like what the Doctor would say, that's him communicating with you. Like, if you say that, like now, age 25, you'd be like, okay, you're deluded. But if you told me that age 10, I'd be like, and then if my friends told me that and they agreed and they thought the same, you'd start to think, well, maybe there's something to it. And then if you spend the next 10 years believing that voice in your head was the Doctor, then 10 years on, when someone's like, no, Logan, it's a TV show, like, that's all it is. Then on a very intellectual level, you'd be able to say, well, yeah, I can see the cameras, I can see the script, like, you can see it's not real. But then there's another part of you that would say, well, no, for 10 years I've been in relationship with the Doctor. We've shared moments together. I know the kind of things he would say to me. Like, we have a shared history. Like, that's the bit that's difficult to let go of. And I think that's true for a lot of Christians, a lot of my friends I've spoken to. Like, they admit readily a lot of the problems that I have with the Bible. Like, when I've vented and they've been gracious enough to listen and hear me out, like, they've often not disputed it. They've often not gone and said, no, that's wrong. That, they've not gone apologetics on me. They've been honest and said, yeah, I'm not sure about that either. But I think for them, I don't know, maybe if they've not had the same thing, because I think for me, that inner, what I did have of the inner dialogue between me and God quite quickly became warped when I was trying to understand my sexuality, because suddenly I thought, well, I don't see God as a loving voice anymore, which meant that when I hear those things in my head, I'm like, well, I'm not sure that's God, because in my mind, like, the God figure was saying things like, yeah, it's fine. Like, I know you, I love you, like, I accept you the way you are. But I was thinking, but that's not what the Bible says. Like that's not, so if that's going on inside my head, then that's not God, that's me. And I think if people have not gone through that process, if they've not had a reason to shake that idea that the voice inside their head is not God, then they're going to have trouble letting go of that from external reasons. If someone else tells them that's not God, then, they're more likely to push back on that and be like, no, I know him, like, we have history. Whereas if there's something within yourself which forces you to realize that voice is not God, it's just you and a name you've put to it, I think that's when it becomes more uncomfortable. So I think that's what happened to me. And I think maybe a part of it is that for other people, they've still got that going on and they've not broken away from that. But I also have to get to this point where I think, I don't know what's going on inside people's heads. And I think I just have to have a bit of humility where I think, maybe that's it, but maybe it's something entirely different. I don't know, but that's how from my perspective now, that's, I think, maybe how I'm trying to come to terms with a lot of the language that I previously understood within the church.
Right. I am, again, just as an observer of humanity and the going through the process myself and talking to people who have deconverted, what I think the idea of a relationship with God fulfills is a deep-seated human need to be known.
Yeah.
And I think you struck something very interesting there, that your inner monologue that was God for you was very loving and caring and accepted you for who you were. And it was the disparity between that and looking at the Bible that caused you to second guess that is that God. I think that if we had the capacity to, if the Vulcan mind meld existed, religion would die overnight.
Yeah.
Right. Like if we had the ability to truly be known by other human beings, you look online, right? I feel seen, I feel heard, right? That's the mantra that you hear when someone describes something that you relate to so well. We deeply need to have the sense of being known, and God, the concept of God, fulfills this, because who knows you better than you yourself?
Yeah.
It turns out God has exactly my sense of humor. It turns out God has exactly my sense of morality.
It's convenient, isn't it?
Yes, my exact sense of justice, right? My exact sense of righteousness. And it is that recognition of, wait a second, maybe that's just me.
Yeah.
That is devastating. It's absolutely devastating. In your blog, you talked about, again, your studies of the Bible and beginning to recognize the humanity in it.
Yeah.
That the Bible was a collection of human books. And I think that was just really beautiful, because I think there's something, as on the other side of faith, we can actually appreciate the books of the Old and the New Testament if we see them as books about human beings describing what it was like for them to be humans at that particular time and that particular culture.
No, absolutely. And like, that's one of the things that I do notice among the sort of post-Christian community is that, and I understand it because I feel a lot of it myself, is when you tied up so much of your identity and self-worth into this book or collection of books, then when it hurts you, you want to throw the whole lot out. And so I get that. And in one sense, I don't actually think that people who feel that way need to appreciate it. I think it's perfectly okay for them to leave it behind. Because I think what drew me to the Bible in the first place, other than being bored on a family holiday, was just this world that it presented, this fascinating sort of different culture and just a different way of seeing things. And I think that still holds for me. I don't think that what they're describing is real, but I still think it's a fascinating way to look at the world. And one of the things that I sort of did in my third year of undergrad, and then when I went on to study a master's, was to look a little bit more at the ancient Near Eastern world more widely, and sort of Mesopotamian religion and all of that wonderful area. And I think similarly, it's this world where, and even not even just that, but I mean, because I'm now training to teach RE, so I'm training to teach religion in schools. That's kind of what my day job is going to become. And to do that, I've had to look into other religions.
Sure.
And even within like Hinduism, you kind of see that's another thing. One of the things that fell away, this humanity that I realized, is that a lot of the world went through the same religious steps at the same time. So you'll see that even though they wouldn't actually have had direct contact, like India and Israel were not direct neighbors, like there was not going to be a whole lot of sharing of ideas, and yet they sort of did a lot of similar things, because I think that's just how humanity kind of progresses. And there was this whole like sacrificial stage where you believed that through offering animals on fire or through doing some kind of rituals, you could actually affect the world around you. And now we obviously know that's not true, but there's something about it that's just a really like mesmerizing picture of reality. It could affect but a lot of it's terrifying as well, because it wasn't just, they wanted to create this car out of nowhere, so they offered this. It was more about, I think, averting catastrophe than it was just about bringing about good things. It's this sense of uncontrollableness of the world and trying to find some
Yeah.
way of controlling it. And that's kind of what sacrifice provided, this idea that, okay, we can't really do anything about sickness or disease or death or the weather or all of these horrible conditions, but maybe if we do these rituals, it worked that time. So maybe there's something going on here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's also the drive for prayer, right?
Oh, 100%.
The world is a chaotic mess, and we have a real sense of our lack of control over what happens to us. And this idea of being able to do something, make a sacrifice, pray, what have you, to make it that change to our benefit is real attractive.
Oh, I completely agree. Because like I occasionally still find myself, I don't like actively pray. It would be quite an odd thing. I'm not quite sure what words I would voice, but I almost find that urge before I do something that I'm less certain about. I sort of feel this urge to ask God for help, because that's what I always used to do before. But that came out of this idea of trying to almost pass on the responsibility. Because when you believe there's a God, there's this idea that actually, oh, maybe I can pass on a little bit of that weight to someone else, before for different situations. It might be like when you see all the suffering in the world, you think, well, if I pray about it, I've done something, or if you're, there's always the idea that I think was, it's always quite an attractive idea that no matter what happens, you're not in control of it. And I think that goes both ways. I now sort of think if God is in control of it and God is as described in the Bible, that's quite a horrifying idea. But there's also the sense of, if I'm going to go into a situation that's difficult, if I've prayed, I've done all I can. It's out of my hands. God's going to look out for it. And I think, like you say, that's just a human reaction. I think the idea of having full responsibility for our lives is terrifying.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we really want that. I think we want it to a point. Like, I think we do want a good amount of like autonomy and all of this, free will and such. But I think there's a level where we want to be able to have something to place blame on. We want to have something that we can sort of have as a foundation and a comfort that they're looking after me, and this idea that I'm not alone. So I think that's one of the things that does drive a lot of religious beliefs. It's deep within us is rooted this idea of not wanting to be alone. Essentially, we want there to be someone else, and therefore, I think if there's a system which tells us that there is this person looking out for us, unless you find like a good reason not to believe that, you'll snap it up.
It's a compelling story.
Yeah, certainly.
And your story is a compelling story. And I am really excited just to watch where you go with things, right? Like your writing, I think is really powerful. And so let people know how they can get in touch with you. How can they find your work?
Yeah. So the main place would probably be on Twitter, which is @It'sBeyondBelief. Mainly because Beyond Belief itself was taken, and I tried all of the dashes and numbers. So there's a little bit of an it's in there first. Or on my blog, which is beyondbelief-blog.com.
Okay.
I managed to get a dash in there. So part of me is irritated that I couldn't have it all conform. And I was also going to branch out to these other platforms, and they didn't even have any of these ready. So I had to start doing all of these other numbers and words. Right. But yes, so any of those options, if anyone drops me a message, I'm always very happy to chat to people.
Excellent. Logan, thank you so much for sharing with just such honesty, and I just appreciate your story.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Final thoughts on the episode. I love Logan's sense of humor and the way that he tells his story. I was cracking up when he was telling the story of telling the vicar that he was gay, and what a awkward conversation that must have been. It is interesting to hear the differences between the UK and the United States. I've had a lot of people from the UK on the podcast in the past, and there's always interesting little subtleties that are different there. As I mentioned at the top of the show, I really want to ask those of you who are believers or apologists to not hold Logan's honesty against him. This is what it looks like and sounds like when someone is being honest about what they experience. Logan was honest about not being 100% certain of what his relationship with God was like. Did he believe it or not? I think that is really important, that you have people in your pews who doubt whether they have a relationship with God. And the reason for that is we are asking people to believe that the emperor's clothes are beautiful. The other thing that's interesting about Logan is how obviously bright he is, the research that he's done, working on his master's, a depth of understanding, having read the scriptures as a young person and then reading them multiple times, studying the history, the archaeology, the textual criticism. He had a very deep understanding, and those were some of the things that led him to doubt. I think we touched on a really important topic when we talked about the issue of intimacy. The evangelical, and here I mean in the United States sense, has made the anti-LGBTQ and anti-affirming stance of basically stating that a whole class of people can never have an intimate relationship. It is because of their obsession with sex and policing sexual mores. This is damaging human beings. This is hurting people. I was pleased to hear that Logan was able to come out to his first church group, and it wasn't a particularly big deal. I wish that were more the case in the United States. I highly recommend Logan's blog, beyondbelief-blog.com. His writings about all of the topics we discussed here are eloquent and worth your time. There'll be links in the show notes for that, as well as links for his appearance on John Steigard's YouTube channel. I want to thank Logan for telling his story with such honesty and passion and intellectual integrity. Thank you, Logan, for being on the show. Another reminder that I will be doing the interview with Alice Gretchen with her new book, Wayward, and that episode will be out February 1st, and her book will be out February 2nd. So please look forward to buying that book. It is amazing. She is going into the story of growing up evangelical in kind of the most extreme circumstances, where her parents were trying to live by faith, and she was uprooted multiple times. And just the process of going through puberty, growing up, the 90s kiss dating goodbye, Josh Harris, oppression of sexuality, and her self-discovery process, and the incredible wit and intelligence that she brings to this book is amazing. Please check it out. Coming up soon. My apologies for the political references over the last few episodes. It's hard to express the level of relief that I feel after the inauguration of President Biden. This really has never particularly been about policy, although obviously I disagreed with the policies of the Trump administration. It was much more about competence, integrity, character, and leadership, all of which Trump lacks, and all of which I believe Biden has. Whether he was your guy during the primaries or not, I think I have a tremendous amount of hope that we move forward from here. Which leads me to the secular grace thought of the week, and that is the difficult tension of standing up for justice, for what is right, the need for truth and reconciliation. We cannot deny the terrible things that have been done and been said. We have to acknowledge those straight out. But we also do, in fact, have to heal. How do we reach across these barriers to people with whom we disagree so deeply? I find that I am compelled to find a way to find common facts, to find common truth, to work from there to build some kind of consensus and a path forward. I do not have any answers here. I'm just challenging each one of you who are listening, after the dust has settled, to reach out to people who may have been on the other side, if you are safe in doing so, and try to build some bridges back again. That's the secular grace thought of the week. Until next time, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. If you have audio engineering expertise and you'd be interested in participating in the Graceful Atheist podcast, get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google Secular Grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.